The dust tasted of defeat. Alara knelt in the yard, the rough broom handle a familiar weight against her calloused hands, the grit a constant reminder of her place. This was not the life she had envisioned when they'd set sail, full of foolish hope for a new world. The voyage had taken everything: her parents, their meager savings, and finally, her freedom. Sold off the ship like a crate of unwanted goods, she found herself bound to Mr. Thorne, a man whose eyes held the same cold calculation as the sparse, unforgiving land stretching out around his isolated homestead. The wind, sharp as a blade, whipped through the valley, carrying the scent of pine and the promise of an early, brutal winter. It mirrored the chill settling deep within her bones, a cold that had nothing to do with the dropping temperature and everything to do with despair. Her days were a monotonous cycle of chores under Thorne's watchful, often cruel, eye. The nights offered little respite, filled with the gnawing fear of what tomorrow might bring, or worse, what he might demand beyond labor. She was property, stripped of dignity, her future a bleak expanse mirroring the horizon. Hope was a fragile bird, easily crushed in this harsh corner of the world. Yet sometimes a flicker remained. It appeared in fleeting glimpses, a hawk circling overhead, a distant peak catching the last light, or the infrequent sight of a rider passing on the dusty trail far beyond Thorne's property line. One rider, in particular, had passed several times in recent weeks. He was different, silent, cloaked in worn leather, moving with a quiet competence that spoke of skills forged in solitude and necessity. He never stopped, barely glanced towards the homestead. Yet Alara felt an unseen weight when he was near, a prickle of awareness that disrupted the numb rhythm of her existence. His horse was as lean and focused as he was, his rifle carried with practiced ease. He was an outsider, clearly not beholden to the small, insular community Thorne dominated. People whispered about him, tales of a man who kept to himself, trading furs and supplies, beholden to no one. Dangerous, some said. Unpredictable. Alara saw only distance and a freedom she could only dream of. Thorne's presence was a heavier, more immediate threat than the distant rider. His movements were slow, deliberate, predatory. He circled her work area sometimes, his shadow falling over her like a shroud. His words were few, but laden with implication, reminding her constantly of her debt, her helplessness. "You understand your situation, girl?" he'd rasp, his voice like dry leaves skittering across stone. "No one's coming for you. Your kind is worth only what they can provide." He didn't need to elaborate. The other servants, few and beaten down, avoided her gaze. She was the newest acquisition, her vulnerability a sharp contrast to their resigned endurance. Her young age, her solitary status, marked her for a specific, horrifying fate she felt drawing closer with each passing day. The broom felt heavier, the dust thicker, the cold wind biting deeper. Despair tightened its grip, threatening to extinguish the last ember of hope. The air grew heavy, thick with the scent of wood smoke and tension. Days blurred into a relentless cycle of labor. Alara scrubbed floors until her knees ached, hauled water until her arms burned, and endured Thorne's simmering gaze, which promised a future more terrible than simple servitude. He had spoken to her housekeeper, voices low and guttural, just within earshot. Words like papers, arrangements, and winter, the implications settled like stones in her gut. He wasn't just buying her labor. He was making her a permanent fixture, potentially selling her on or worse. The remote rider, Reese, had passed again that morning, a dark shape against the pale sky. This time, his eyes had flickered towards the house for a fraction of a second longer than usual. A trick of the light? Her desperate imagination? She couldn't be sure. But that fleeting, almost imperceptible acknowledgement had been a small, cool drop in the vast, hot desert of her fear. Thorne cornered her by the woodshed later that day. His face was close, his breath foul with stale spirits. "The arrangements are made, girl," he sneered, his hand reaching for her arm. "Come winter, you'll be bound proper. No more foolish notions of running off." His grip tightened, bruising. Alara flinched, fear a hot wave, but something else flared too. A spark of defiance, tiny but fierce. This was it. The line. His hand dropped abruptly as a shadow fell over them. Rhys stood at the edge of the yard, seemingly emerged from the trees. He held no weapon, made no overt threat, but his presence was a disruption, a silent challenge. His gaze was steady, directed not at Thorn, but at Alara. It was brief, unreadable, yet it held an intensity that silenced Thorn's bluster. Thorn recovered, puffing out his chest. "Just passing through, is it?" he called out, his voice strained. Rhys gave a curt nod, his eyes still on Alara for another heartbeat. Then, he turned and walked back towards his horse, mounted with fluid grace, and rode away without a word. Thorn watched him go, his face a mask of annoyance and something else, something akin to unease. When he turned back to Alara, his expression hardened, but he didn't touch her again. Not then. That night, sleepless on her straw pallet, Alara replayed the moment. Rhys hadn't spoken, hadn't done anything in the conventional sense. Yet, his simple presence had altered the dynamic, had given her a brief, precious reprieve. Was it deliberate? Or just a coincidence? She didn't know. But a seed of possibility, however dangerous, had been planted. She watched the moon trace its path across the sky, listening to the wind moan through the eaves. The arrangements were made. Winter was coming. If she was to survive, she had to be as daring as the stranger, as unforgiving as the land itself. There was no one else. The following day broke cold and gray. Thorn was preoccupied with a visitor, a stout, unpleasant man who spoke in hushed tones about papers and deliveries. Alara worked near the barn, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Rhys had ridden past again, earlier than usual. This time, he had paused just beyond the fence line, ostensibly checking his horse's shoe. But his eyes, under the brim of his hat, had met hers. And this time, there was no mistaking the message. A subtle tilt of his head towards the woods. A fraction of a moment, gone as quickly as it appeared. But the message was clear. A chance. A desperate, terrifying chance. The visitor left mid-morning. Thorn retreated indoors. This was it. Alara moved deliberately, completing her chores with practiced efficiency. All the while her senses were heightened to an almost unbearable degree. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind, every distant sound was a potential warning. She finished her work, gathered her meager belongings, a worn shawl, a small, smooth stone from the riverbank, a piece of hardtack saved from yesterday's meager meal, and slipped out the back door of the barn. The air was sharp, stinging her lungs. She kept to the edge of the tree line, moving as silently as she could, her heart hammering against her ribs. She reached the designated spot, a thicket of pines Thorn usually avoided. He was there. Rhys. His horse was tethered nearby, saddled and ready. He didn't speak, just extended a hand. His face was unreadable, etched with the harsh lines of the frontier, but his eyes held a quiet intensity that felt like a promise. Without hesitation, Alara placed her hand in his. His grip was firm, strong, grounding. He pulled her up onto the horse behind him. The horse shifted, then broke into a controlled canter, disappearing into the dense woods. They rode hard, leaving Thorn's homestead far behind. The forest was their shield, the winding trails their escape route. Alara clung to Rhys's back, the unfamiliar motion jarring but exhilarating. Fear was still present, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was tempered by a fierce, desperate hope. Freedom. Every hoofbeat pounded it into the ground. Rhys navigated the treacherous terrain with an almost instinctive knowledge, his movements efficient, silent. He didn't speak, didn't look back, his focus solely on the path ahead. Alara watched his back, the set of his shoulders, the way he held the reins. Everything about him spoke of competence and quiet determination. They stopped only when the light began to fade, finding shelter in a small, rocky overhang. Rhys built a tiny, smokeless fire, shared his meager provisions, and indicated a spot for her to rest. Their communication was limited to gestures, nods, and brief, necessary words. "Eat," he'd said, pushing a piece of dried meat towards her. Sleep, simple commands, devoid of unnecessary kindness, yet carrying a weight of protection she hadn't known in years. Thorn would be after them. She knew that with chilling certainty. He would not let his property go easily. The night was long, filled with the sounds of the wilderness and the constant hum of fear, but curled by the small fire, watching Rhys keep silent vigil, Alara felt a tentative sense of safety. It was fragile, hard-won, and entirely dependent on the stoic stranger who had offered her this desperate chance. The chase was inevitable. Thorn and a couple of hired hands were tracking them. Rhys knew it. Alara felt it in the taut silence between them, in the way Rhys constantly scanned their surroundings, his eyes missing nothing. They moved through rugged country, leaving as little trace as possible, their pace relentless. Alara, fueled by desperation and a burgeoning resilience, kept up, her body aching but her spirit hardening. They faced obstacles: a swollen creek, a sheer rock face, a sudden, chilling rain that threatened to erase their trail but also soak them to the bone. Rhys's skills were evident in every decision he made, every path he chose. He moved through the wilderness like a part of it, attuned to its rhythms and dangers. Alara watched, learned, and felt a quiet admiration bloom, replacing her initial fear of him. He was not the threat. The world, and the men who sought to control her within it, were. One afternoon, the sound carried on the wind, the distant baying of hounds, the shouts of men. They were close. Rhys's face tightened. He led them off the main trail, scrambling up a steep, boulder-strewn slope towards a narrow canyon mouth. There was no turning back. They dismounted, the horse hidden in a small copse. Rhys handed Alara a knife. His gaze met hers, intense and steady. "Stay low," he murmured, his voice rough but clear. "If they come, you hide. Don't make a sound." It wasn't a command. It was a statement of brutal fact, a transfer of responsibility. He wasn't just her rescuer. He was her partner in survival. He moved to the canyon entrance, rifle ready, blending into the rock face. Alara crept deeper into the canyon, the cold stone pressing against her back. The sounds of pursuit grew louder, closer. She could hear Thorn's angry shouts, his voice thick with malice. He wanted her back. Not for her labor, not even for her value, but for the principle of ownership, for the humiliation of being defied. Footsteps echoed on the stone outside. Voices were low, calculating. Alara held her breath, the knife clutched in her trembling hand. She was terrified, but beneath the fear, a hard resolve was forming. She would not go back. Not ever. A shot rang out, sharp and sudden, followed by a cry of pain. More shouts, confused and angry. Then silence, heavy and tense. Alara waited, every nerve screaming. She didn't know what had happened, who had been hit. The silence stretched, agonizing. Finally, Rhys's voice, low and measured, broke the stillness. "They're gone," he called out, his voice strained. For now, Alara emerged slowly from the shadows, her legs unsteady. Rhys stood at the canyon mouth, reloading his rifle. One of Thorn's men lay wounded, abandoned by the others, Thorn himself apparently having retreated. It was a brutal testament to the stakes involved. Rhys looked at her, his expression unreadable. In that moment, Alara saw not a stranger, but a protector, a fellow survivor, the silent architect of her freedom. The immediate threat had receded, but the shadow of Thorn and the harsh realities of the frontier remained. They continued their journey, the bond between Alara and Rhys deepening into something unspoken but profound. They were two solitary figures against the vast, indifferent landscape, their connection forged in shared danger and mutual reliance. Rhys taught her how to track, how to read the signs of the wilderness, how to handle the knife he had given her not just as a weapon, but as a tool for survival. Alara, in turn, brought a quiet strength, a resilience that surprised even herself. She had been a possession, fragile and broken, but hardship had tempered her, honing her spirit into something sharp and enduring. One evening, camped by a clear mountain stream, Rhys spoke, his voice low, almost a whisper against the rustling leaves. "Thorn won't forget," he said, stating the obvious truth. "But this land is wide, and people forget quickly when trouble comes calling." It wasn't a promise of absolute safety, but an acknowledgement of their precarious freedom. Alara nodded, understanding. They weren't truly safe, perhaps never would be in the conventional sense, but they were free. Free from Thorn's grasp, free to choose their own path, however uncertain. Looking at Rhys, she saw the lines of solitude etched around his eyes, the quiet dignity in his posture. He had given her a chance when no one else would, not out of charity, but from some hidden code within himself. He had not demanded gratitude or servitude, only silent partnership in their escape. And in doing so, he had allowed her to find her own strength. The vulnerable girl sold into servitude had been stripped away, replaced by a woman who understood the language of the wind, the necessity of vigilance, the quiet power of her own will. Her hands, once raw from endless chores, were now capable, learning to handle a rifle, to skin a small game. Freedom, Alara realized, wasn't just the absence of chains. It was the presence of self. It was the ability to stand on her own 2 feet, facing the daunting horizon not with despair, but with a quiet, determined hope. Rhys had opened the gate, but she had walked through it under her own power, finding strength she never knew she possessed in the face of overwhelming odds. The frontier remained a challenging, unforgiving place, but now, it felt less like a prison and more like a canvas of possibility. The world was vast, and they were small within it, but they were together, 2 solitary souls finding connection and resilience in the wild heart of the land. Their future was unwritten, uncertain, but it was theirs. And for Alara, who had known only ownership and despair, that was everything.